Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Keeping Relevant. I first met my guest, Adrienne Kivelson, more than 60 years ago. She was the only person who came to a coffee clutch for a city council candidate I was supporting. Since then, she's worked for city, state, and federal governments. She also wrote a book, an excellent tutorial called What Makes New York City Run. It was first published by the League of Women Voters in 1979, and its 5th edition will soon be available. So we've had a long history.
Yes, we have.
And we have a lot to talk about.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
So do you think this new edition is going to show a different New York City?
I think it's certainly going to show a different New York City than in 1979 when I wrote the first book.
Yeah.
And
there were some major changes in the charters.
Yes. Most of them really made it a more democratic city. And it also enhanced the financial bookkeeping of the city, because prior to 1979 and 1975, when the city literally went bankrupt, there were very few financial controls on the city. And money was spent without any returns. And the charter very largely was created. The charter changes that happened in 1975 were created primarily in response to that, to the financial problems of the city. And as part of that, there was a sense that there had to be more a connection between the citizens of the city and the government establishment. And so charters over the years have broadened citizen participation and improved financial accounting.
The charter is like a basic constitution.
Yeah, the charter is our constitution. We were created, everybody thinks New York City's been here forever, but in fact, we're only a city as of 1898. Prior to that, it was counties. Queens was a bunch of towns, and the Bronx was part of Westchester County. And so the city as a city has only been in place since 1898. And it was created by the state, and the state gave us a charter. That's our form of government. So that's our constitution.
Well, they've changed the officials in the charter, by the charter. There have been charter changes.
There have been charter
that
changes.
Created new citywide positions.
Right. Well, for example, in 1938, there was a Board of Aldermen, and that was reconstituted as a city council. Up until 1975, 1988, there was a president of the New York City Council, and that job was eliminated.
And there was a Board of
Estimate, which really ran the city. That was interesting because the Board of Estimate had, each borough president had one vote on the Board of Estimate, and they really controlled everything. They controlled planning. They controlled the use of the streets. They could outvote everybody on the budget. They really were a very controlling body. It was the mayor, the president of the city council, the controller. They each had 2 votes, and the 5 borough presidents each had 1 vote. The city council voted on the budget, but they had to agree at some point with the Board of Estimate. It was very powerful. And then one person, one vote came along, and everybody looked and said that we don't have one person, one vote if the borough president of Staten Island has the same vote as the borough president of Brooklyn. We also at one point had, we had 2 additional city council members from each borough. And that was also eliminated, because the minute you're talking about same representation for Staten Island and Brooklyn or Queens and the Bronx, you have to, that's not one person, one vote.
Why hasn't that ever, has that ever been discussed for the United States Senate?
Not that I know of.
Because it's in the Constitution. They set it up.
Yeah, it is.
So funny. So anyway, that was in 1989.
That's right. That was changed in 1989. And each charter change from 75 through the most recent one has broadened citizen participation. The council went to 51 members in 1988. The community boards, which had existed in Manhattan since the 50s, were made citywide, and they were given some jobs they actually could do. They didn't have a lot of veto power, but they could get involved in planning. And each charter change, there's been more participation. So we went to ranked choice voting through a charter change. which gave people more opportunity to make choices for city office and primaries.
And that was just done last year.
That was recently. That
yeah.
was a few years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh. And what about term limits?
Well, term limits is a charter change, but we have a unique thing in New York City where we have citizen initiative, where 50,000 citizens can get something on the ballot. That was put on the ballot through a citizen initiative, not through a charter commission. And everybody has a different feeling about whether it's something that is valuable or not.
I think it's very harmful. I think the terms are too short, 2 4-year terms. This past election, or one before, we had 35 members of a 51-member council, all new. I mean, and everybody expires every 2 years, and it doesn't give any stability, and it certainly doesn't give any history.
Yeah,
There's no sense there.
Yeah, it's very different because the council prior to that, people stayed on the council, could stay on the council if they were reelected by their voters, who really should be the ones who make
Forever.
these decisions. But they also developed expertise. Council members who that was their career. They were going to stay with the council. They were going to be experts on education or on budget or on something that was meaningful. Now council members are elected for 2 terms. The first term you're learning how to be a council member, and the second term you're trying to figure out what the next job is going to be because you're going to be out.
Right.
So it really it changes the nature of legislation, it changes the nature of council, and suddenly the staff becomes
Controlling thing.
more controlling. Yeah, that's my opinion.
But what's interesting is a lot of the staff then also runs.
They run. Yeah. Well, the reason that's another change that happened in the charter, and that is that we fund city council campaigns, and that has made it really possible for anybody to run with public financing. And it's of course there are always some few problems, but by and large it's a very good system. And that was changed through the charter, and it really does enable people to run for council, run for mayor, run for any citywide office.
Before we leave the term limits, it was the whim of a businessman, Ron Lauder,
yes,
that financed this campaign,
right,
who really doesn't know that much about politics and certainly doesn't know about government. And it's something we're seeing more and more today.
Yeah.
With all kinds of institutions. I mean, even the colleges and universities where they're wealthy board members and trustees interrupt the way that business is more wisely conducted.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
Yeah, and people, I mean, the public voted for it. They approved it, but they saw something that I think is not necessarily realistic. People get upset with their legislators, or they say they do nothing, or they're there too long, because you're seeing this happening around the country with term limits. I think there's been a deepening skepticism about people who are serving in public office. People see them as self-serving, and the universe that I grew up in and have worked in is that most public officials are really dedicated to doing a very good job. And I think they're not viewed with the type of we're praised professors who stay in their jobs at a university for 50 years, and they're experts on the field. But if people stay in government for a long time, they're considered hacks, or they couldn't do anything better with their life. I think it's a sad commentary on
even
how we see
in the universities they have tenure, which ensures that you're there for a long time.
Right.
But you touch a very important part of it. And you and I started when we were very young. I was a little older than you, but anyway, in the reform movement.
Yeah.
And in the Democratic Party. And it was the Democratic Party was a party that believed in a whole realm. You know, there was a general belief to the Democrat. It's still, I think that party still has it. I think the Republican Party has, lost it. But anyway, we fought within the party, and the party was much more active and included many more people in the decision-making process. And so the local groups that made up the party, the local political clubs and everything. I was thinking about it. We didn't have as many primaries, for instance, right? The primaries were more within
Oh, well, we had pre-primaries in the reform.
And they were in the local organization.
Yes.
So that the reformers came up with their own candidate.
Right.
And fought the regulars and finally took control of the party.
Yeah. Some ways that's happening. It's the other way that it's different in New York was we provided services. Political parties provided services. And
that was before.
Yes, it was before the poverty program. It was, if somebody, and we were on the west side of Manhattan, and Thursday night, some of the lawyers in the political club would be there, and people would come up with their problems with their landlords and with the street sweeping and whatever the problem might be. And district leaders were quite influential in city government. In one way, that was replaced by community boards, and which we think is a wonderful kind of thing, but it took away a very beneficent part of the political parties. The political parties are now, that's what they're concentrating on. They're concentrating on the politics of it. And so it may have diminished the community involvement that they were required. I mean, you were not, if you didn't provide services in your community, in your district, you really basically were not going to get elected in some ways. And I think there is another resource. The community boards, in terms of local service, really have supplanted the political parties.
But they don't have the spirit. And I think that's happened in general in our life, that we spend more time now worrying about who's going to build in the neighborhood or not build, or where the welfare hotels are going to be, or where this is going to be. And we lose sight of larger themes. I mean...
Right. But I think the disparity between rich and poor is also just...
That's definitely...
So suddenly people think they have a right in their community to say nobody else can come in. I find that absolutely extraordinary. So that the whole west side of Manhattan, where you live, was built on land that was taken by the government. Some very poor people lived there. And the idea was they were going to create a mixed community.
That's the urban renewal area.
The urban renewal area, and they were going to create a mixed income community. And it's no longer a mixed income community. And people now don't want that in their neighborhoods. I mean, that's the part I don't, that's generally all over the city, Don't build low-income housing, because they were still building low-income housing in the years that we were...
Well, the urban renewal area did build low-income housing. It built
low-income housing as part of the community, and that's still there, and that's that's
But it built middle-income housing, Mitchell-Lamas, which have stayed.
Yeah.
Everything was built with the idea that you would move from one group to another, right?
Right.
The Mitchell-Lama was middle income until they were able to move on to something else.
Well, public housing was built with the idea that it was temporary, that people were going to be in it temporarily. And now, they're third generation living in public housing.
And Mitchell-Lamas.
And Mitchell-Lamas too, yeah. We haven't solved the housing problem in New York City yet.
But there's so much planning about it. And it's interesting, there are different groups, and there's so much suspicion. It seems to me we're beginning to shift in our attitudes about building mixed income areas or putting lower cost, we're looking for spaces to build, we're looking for office space. It's restless.
Yes, it is, but it's still, there's an unwillingness in many areas to really allow, because you need density in New York City. You can't build, if you're going to build, you're not going to build 5-story, 6-story buildings anymore. You need density because our populations change, and people they don't want their neighborhoods to change, and it's and
we are in a state of change.
Yes, we are. The city is. Yes.
Yeah. It's interesting also the difference between the rich and the poor. So we're losing lots of people who, we have friends who commute for more than an hour every day. It's because they can't find a house or something that they can afford within the district. We're in a mess, I think, actually, when I think about it.
Yeah, I think we are. I think there is an attempt to build housing that is more affordable, but it's very expensive. And the city really has never been. The city has never been the builder of housing. The state really has taken more of a role in building housing, and there's been no agreement in the state on what type of housing everybody wants.
You worked for state housing.
I worked for state housing. I worked in rent regulation, and which is a very major program to keep middle-income people in the city, and it's constantly being challenged and being the restrictions are getting lower, getting harder and harder to keep the level of. There were 1 million rent-regulated houses in the city. But unless that's not now a program that's in effect, it's only those buildings that have been there for more than 30, 40 years.
And Andrew Cuomo, when he was the housing secretary, you worked on a special project?
Well, I was in HUD for a while and worked in HUD. HUD, even in New York, never, they're not builders. And HUD is a national organization. They supervise public housing, and they're very interested in home ownership, which in New York City is not necessarily the ideal way to construct things. And when I was working for HUD, just before that there was an administration where they passed a bill that said you couldn't build any more public housing. You could
Who
build
passed
mixed.
the bill?
Congress passed a bill. It was and which said you can't build exclusively public housing. It has to be mixed use. That also cut down on how much low-income housing you were building. So nobody is really funding building low-income housing, and the best we're coming up with is mixed-use housing, with
with the 421A.
Well, we don't have that anymore
Right.
because the state doesn't have. That was a state program, and that they haven't passed a tax abatement. That encourages builders to come in and build housing for this tax abatement. We're in a quandary, I think, now.
Are you following the governor's housing proposals?
They're significant. The problem is New York State she's trying to pass a program that will require housing being built all over the state, and communities outside of New York City are not interested in building the kind of multifamily housing that she's encouraging, and so they can't pass everything that we might like in New York City.
So it's an extension of NIMBY, in a way.
In a way, it is. In a way, it is. And I live in a very urban part of Queens, and we are.
Well, you live in a very interesting part of Queens,
live
which
in an interesting
has
part.
changed significantly
Yes.
since you lived there.
Yes.
Right.
And they're putting up.
Where do you live?
I live in downtown Flushing, and they're putting up high rises in the area, very expensive housing, condos and co-ops, and there's a population, particularly an older population, they cannot afford that, so it's really changing the nature of the community, and I think that's happening all over the city.
Well, I live on the west side.
Yeah.
I've never moved out of it, so I've moved from most recently 93rd Street to 67th to 57th, and our property taxes I don't really detect that much difference in the west side, except that everything is more expensive. The apartments start higher
Right.
and go higher. Do you agree with me about
Yes,
that perception?
Yes, absolutely, and there's really inequities in taxing on who's taxed at what level, and the private home in anywhere is taxed at a much lower rate
Right.
than multiple dwellings.
The property tax is a whole interesting concept. Is that in the charter?
The property tax is actually in state law, and it's the only thing the city of New York can pass on its own without getting the approval of the state.
Where does it have to go for retail tax?
That also has to go to the state. So the sales tax is the sales tax in New York City is governed by New York State. That's one of the things that we always have to keep in mind. We are a product of New York City and of New York State, and there are all kinds of restrictions on what the city can pass on its own. And if it's anything that looks like there might be state interest, there is a municipal home rule law, but it's sometimes very shady. And the one I remember is we tried to ban plastic bags a few years ago, and the state stopped us for about 3 years. They said no. I mean, it seemed so innocuous to me. And then they eventually passed a state law. So we really, there's things, if taxing is limited in what we can tax, we can't set, our debt limit is set by state law, housing law is set by state law. So we're the biggest part of the state, but we are limited in many ways by what the state will permit us.
So let's go to the property tax. The state has part to do with the property tax.
I believe the state, yes, the state, but the city can, if the state does, the city can determine it, but I think the state sets limitations. Our education law is state law. Multiple dwelling law is state law.
Our transportation system.
Our transportation system is, yes, that's definitely state law. MTA runs the transit in New York City.
So what is the city's, do you know what the city's role is in accepting or not accepting the
limitations of the state? Well,
the congested pricing.
Yeah, that's MTA is a state entity, and I think that MTA can. We have seats on it on the Metropolitan Transit Authority. We do have New York City has seats on that board, but I believe it's really a state.
So
agency.
Do you know who sets the commuter tax? If there
isn't
one?
a commuter
There
tax.
isn't anymore.
Not that I know of.
Right.
Yeah.
Does that get set by the state legislature?
Oh, it was, yes. Yeah, it was set, and then it was abandoned a number of years ago.
And does the charter say anything about the transportation?
No. No, the charter does not have anything about, not that I mean, and there might be something. There's a Department of Transportation in the city of New York, so
right.
That would be in the charter. The charter says nothing about education. And
that's still a debate.
That's a debate, and we do have city education law, which can be which the state has given us the mayor the authority to run the public schools. So there is something which I personally believe belongs in the charter on how New York City public schools are, but there isn't anything in the charter about New York City public schools because a curriculum and requirements for teachers are state requirements, and so the city's way, and I think an interesting way, is by opening up city government, which I think community boards do, and now there's something that's called participatory budgeting in the city, and young people, 12, 13, I think, can participate in participatory budgeting. I think all of that is trying to develop a group of people who are interested in what's happening in the city, understand it enough to try and become a lobbying force to get the city services that we need.
But at the same time, the participation voting has consistently gone down.
Yeah.
So how do you run a government if you don't, if you can't get people to vote? And why can't we get people to vote?
I don't know. There's now a movement to say maybe we should have elections the same year as we have
local. Yeah.
I'm afraid we'll really get lost.
Right.
That if you have senators and state senators and assemblymen, because you're going down the ballot and get down to city council, I'm afraid
we won't even know who they are.
We're afraid we'll really get lost.
They'll get elected with 1,000 votes.
One of the things that I think is really troubling is we don't have much local press.
Yeah.
And the city papers and the city stations don't cover the localities the way they used to.
Is that because we also don't have the charismatic leaders that we might have had before? That we don't have, there's not enough importance put to these local.
I don't know that people know who their legislators are because they're not around for very long.
Yeah.
So, you know, the people we knew who were councilmen and congressmen, and they were fixtures in the community. I mean, they just were, their stature was such. And I think, you know, 4 years in, 4 years out, and you've lost that.
And that, I mean, I know I'm a retired public official, but it's only my age group,
Right.
basically, that even has the slightest idea what I ever did. There's just no history. There's no spirit about it.
Yeah, well, hopefully, I think, you know, getting kids, and there is some evidence that we are getting young people involved in voting, and I think that's a key. I just don't understand. I don't understand why people don't vote. I mean, it's so easy. They made it so easy to vote now that maybe it's, you know, I mean, on principle, I can still get to my poll, and I wait till election day and I vote, but you have 5 days of early voting, you have absentee ballots. They make it so easy to vote. I don't understand it.
And it used to be so much fun.
So, and it was fun, and it still can be fun. And I think that's our responsibility to get people
I don't think we've reminisced enough to bring that spirit. But thank you, Adrienne. It's been a great discussion. And people should really read the book.
Yeah.
It's important to understand.
It's a great book. You can contact the lead.
Status of the charter.
Yeah.
And try to follow the city. Please try to follow the city politics.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.